didn't have any opportunity to make any observations or comments, questions around those presentations. So I don't know if anyone would like to make an intervention now about the presentations we heard before lunch, and then after that we can jump into the session. So feel free to, if you have any questions, or comments, to put them forward now.
Warren. No. I just had two questions for you. One was that you talked about the positive relationship that's been developed with the mining companies and Indigenous people, and I was wondering if that's a result of the Reconciliation Action Plans initiative as part of that. I'm just curious to know, and also, or maybe other insights you have on as to how that positive relationship was built. And then I also wanted to know, you're talking about Indigenous sort of authorities or jurisdiction over some of the lands, or how is that exercised right now by the Indigenous people?
Okay, thanks for those, Dawn. The first one, it started out, as I said, it was a hostile relationship. It was one of the most hostile relationships I've ever seen, because they actually publicly campaigned against the Indigenous rights in a big way for the law to be changed. And that went on for about 10 years. And then they come to the conclusion that it's just good business. Now, I'm not saying they come to the table kissy cuddly and our friend. It was just good business case for them to do that. And from that, the relationship is still a business case, but it's a lot more warmer than it was. Yeah. So that was a simple process, because the reality was that through the land rights native title process, the Indigenous rights were really, ramped it up. It's got to the stage now where mining companies don't even think twice about having to deal with Indigenous groups. They even do it, even if the Indigenous groups don't own that land. They do it as respect to that country, that conversation. So that it is an interesting case. Hugh Morgan, who used to be chairman of the Western Mining Company in Australia, was the leader of that campaign against us, and here we are, 24 years later, and we're very good friends. We came into this house for dinner, so that's yeah. And I think it's quite weird, but that's what happened. In regard to the authorisation process, how Indigenous people exercise that, there's still it's not fully put down at the moment. There are still some problems with it. In fact, we just had a amendment to the Native Title Act, because under the law, the High Court determined that it has to be a unanimous decision. And you can imagine that could be a problem if you had to get an entire nation to agree to a process. In fact, there were two agreements that were signed off that were turned over, another 20 put in danger. So it shows the maturity of the Indigenous groups too, because they actually went to the federal government and the opposition and got them to change the law to their favour. So it isn't a simple majority, it is a lot more than that, but it's not unanimous anymore, which makes it a lot easier to do agreements and through that. There still are some issues with that, because we do have what I call special interest groups, who will always look for one person or a small group of people to try and manipulate that process. We're seeing that at the moment in a number of projects in Queensland, in our state in Queensland, in Northern Australia, where there are a few problems. So there is a process going on now, the discussion, and it is coming again from the Indigenous nations, the First Nations, to see about how they can, fix that so that it is the the First Nation governing body decides to do something, then that goes ahead. You don't have other people playing up to special interest groups there. The argument now is virtually, even though it is not legal, I mean, set in concrete in law, the argument now is that most people adhere to it. In fact, the good thing is the ERA, Energy Resources Australia Company, which runs two uranium mines in the Northern Territory. They couldn't get an expansion of one of their projects, and then they sat down and tried to negotiate it through, and then the Aboriginal community just said, we're not, we don't agree with the expansion of the mining here, and so they shut down their project and just left. So that's been closed at this very moment. The interesting part about that is in that closure process, they're working with the Aboriginal nation there to take up the rehabilitation of the mine site, and that'll be something like a 25, 26-year process to do that, and they'll have them as the preferred partner in cleaning up that site.
So if there aren't any more comments or questions, I'll jump into this session, which is an important one because it's about us seeking some agreement around the scope of the project, and which will enable us to move forward in terms of implementation. And as in any negotiation, there's a framework within which we operate. Obviously, we work to a committee at the OECD that's responsible for regional development, and I've talked about that place-based approach to regional development, that framework that we use. This project depends on financial contributions from countries, so obviously there are limitations in terms of resources, in terms of time that can be spent on work, so we need to make choices about where to focus. And what I'd like to do is to work with countries on an implementation plan for the project in their country in between now and mid-November, so over the next sort of 6-week period. And in that time, we need to agree on things like this survey that we send to countries and Indigenous communities, and what is in that survey, the communities that we're going to engage with in this project, when the missions are going to occur, and the key themes that you wish to explore as well within each case study. So we've structured this session around 3 key topics. The first is around the thematic report, the global report that we intend to deliver. The second is around the country case studies, and then thirdly, it's on the methodology for the project. And so in each of those sessions, we'll talk a bit, as in the OECD team, and then we'll have a discussion around those different elements. In terms of the thematic report, we've done thematic reports on different topics under our committee. We've done work on renewable energy and rural development. We've done work on food security and rural development as well. So there's a sort of framework that we follow when we do those thematic reports. And basically, in this report, what we would like to do is to develop some evidence about Indigenous economies. So what is the contribution that Indigenous people make to regional and national economies, and what are the factors which help enable growth in those economies as well. And then to develop some policy implications from that, so some policy recommendations. And our initial thinking was to organise those policy recommendations around 2 key themes, with one which was land and the other which is people. So land is, and tomorrow we'll talk about that. In terms of people, we've we made a decision to focus on business. I think, as Warren was saying, that to grow an economy, to generate jobs, you need businesses that are successful, generating profit. So the first point of that is to organise it around the needs of business. What do businesses need to grow, to access new markets, to generate new employment? And I'll talk a bit about that. What we also want to do in the project is to develop some basic information from across OECD countries and other countries which participate in our committee who are not members of the OECD, about some basic questions about how many Indigenous people are there, where do they live, what are some of their key socio-economic outcomes. So this information hasn't been brought together yet and verified within the OECD. That's a key role for the OECD in terms of bringing together data that enables comparisons and the sharing of lessons between countries. And so we'll include some analysis of that as well. Now, in terms of the chapters, we'll just give a brief overview of, as I said yesterday, the key thing with any research or project you're doing is to ask the right questions. So we'll give an overview of the questions that we're going to ask in each chapter. What are the sort of recommendations that we think can be developed, which could be applied across different countries, and then a basic storyline and outline. And so we'll run through those 4 chapters quickly, and then we'll then have a discussion about that. So for the statistical chapter, sorry, there's just the chapters, so we'll talk through, as I said. The first one is on the trends and statistics, second is on land management and economic development, third is on business opportunities, and fourth is around governance and implementation. So I'll hand over to Anna, who will talk about the first chapter.
Thank you, Chris. So in this chapter, we have one main objective, which is basically to assess the role and contribution of Indigenous people to regional and national economies, and identify the factors that constrain or enable their economic participation, especially focusing then on the regional level. So this is a list of subsidiary questions that we have come up with. It is not exhaustive, but it gives you an idea of the kind of things we're thinking. Obviously, after all the input we got here, we're going to go back to this and work more, and as we work through the chapter, but these are some of the topics that we thought would follow under the umbrella of this chapter. It's very basic questions, but not easy to answer, such like we saw this morning, who are Indigenous people and where they are located in the participant countries. What is basically the status and key trends in well-being, if we can identify this from the existing data, and economic participation of people at the regional, of the Indigenous people at a regional level. What are the main assets and areas for potential? This is a very important aspect that we will work on for Indigenous communities in regional economies. So not only focusing on gaps, but also on potential contributions, and also how Indigenous communities then contribute integrated with regional economies, and more broadly, if possible, with global value chains, with very important input that we got from Peru, also examples on this, so these kind of questions that were raised this morning. And finally, what are the factors enabling or constraining the participation and the development of these linkages? So we're focused on main topics like human capital, innovation, infrastructure, and land, all on the regional context. So from this chapter, finally, what we want to draw on, and next slide. The potential recommendations that we hope to come up with are general lessons, guidelines, and tools to first assess Indigenous well-being across countries. So this including the identification of priorities for addressing gaps in data collection, and also ways that enable the cross-country comparison analysis of this data. Recommendations for improving data collection within countries, particularly on traditional lands, and ways to strengthen the capacity of Indigenous communities to use data for public policy and development, and of course then ultimately to realize economic development opportunities. So the chapter will be structured generally in this way. First, we'll work through a definition of what indigenous economies are. So we're not going to take this for granted, but I want to review the literature to understand what is the best definition, the most inclusive definition that we can find for indigenous economies. We're going to work through some of the specific methodological issues, so working with indigenous economies, including lack of data, differences between on and off reserve economic activities and communal work. And we're also going to touch upon subnational distribution, including differentiation between rural and urban areas, but also, of course, remote areas. Then in the second part of this chapter, we're going to talk about indigenous economies in a place-based context, so using the framework that we have for rural development that Chris explained yesterday. And as part of this, we're going to try to give an assessment of the assets that indigenous economies have in many different dimensions, such as natural, human, financial, social, cultural, etc. So all of the ones that are important and hopefully that we are going to be able to measure. We're going to have a part of sources of income, including different income source, livelihood, so labor market as part of this. So how indigenous people generate their income and their livelihoods is going to be part of studying the labor market. What are they occupied on? Do they participate in the labor market or not? And how does this differ across gender and ages? And finally, some part on innovation. So if we can include something on measuring traditional knowledge, participation in regional innovation system, etc. And as the last part of this chapter, we'll have the role and contribution of indigenous economies to regional and national economies. Here, identifying key development trends and sectoral opportunities, drawing on the experience of participating countries, and hopefully finding a way to measure the contribution that indigenous economies make to regional economies generally then. So I hand over to Tamara, who's going to talk about the chapter 2.
So as Chris mentioned, the second chapter is about land, which is one of the enabling factors of growth. And is that, no, yeah, let's go back. And land in all its manifestations, because land, of course, is an economic asset, but it's also a traditional, it also has traditional, it's a traditional asset. It's linked to culture, tradition, identity, and culture. And so the main question we're going to be asking in this chapter are, what are the key features of governance arrangements that enable Indigenous communities to realize the development potential of land and related natural resources, including how they negotiate benefits with investors to create sustainable businesses and employment opportunities. As we've seen very different frameworks and very different relationships to land ownership across the countries that we've examined. And that creates different rights and different capacities to use that land. The major issue, of course, is how is that leveraged, owned? How can it be used for economic development? Some of the subsidiary questions here are, what are the instruments, the governance arrangements and instruments that can facilitate economic development on traditional lands? How can they be used to facilitate investment and negotiate community benefits? And what are the key enabling factors and barriers to forms of land and resource development that benefit indigenous communities and regional economies? It's important to think about how the governance frameworks for land, for the management of traditional lands, are aligned or integrated with other institutions and policy areas and programs. To think about regional economic development opportunities, to think about land use planning and management in a really strategic, long-term, and integrated manner across sectors. We'd like to know a little bit more about how traditional knowledge can be actually captured and applied to land management practices that can benefit the community as a whole. And there are some really interesting and innovative practices we've seen from other OECD countries that may be useful here in terms of, for instance, mapping qualitative knowledge to promote land use management practices that are sustainable and drawing on a broader array of data sources. And finally, what are the key lessons in terms of making the governance of land and natural resources work to actually deliver mutual benefits for indigenous communities and regional economies? Since this is, again, we're entering into major projects, needing the knowledge to negotiate well and with a full understanding of the risks and opportunities associated with that. So some of the potential recommendations that could come out of this chapter, much will depend on the type of data that we gather, but how we can improve community and regional development planning and governance, how we can increase access to economic, regional, and rural development programs and reduce sort of regulatory uncertainty and complexity that can be enmeshed within certain governance arrangements. And how can we improve the effectiveness of agreements between Indigenous communities and private sector components in the types of industries like mining? How can we better manage community financial assets from land and natural resource development? And how can we generate new jobs and sources of income from natural resources management? Or other types of services, for instance, ecological services related to land management and so on. A potential outline here is to do basic definitions, to look at how land is governed, and we've seen that there are a variety of approaches here, so to define what that looks like in different countries and the legal implications of those arrangements, to look at the trends and the evolution of land governance, and we've seen, for instance, Warren talking in Australia of how that's evolving quite quickly in some cases. And finally, to have some data on traditional land use in terms of ownership and designated uses. And it would be nice to determine, I'm not sure if this is possible, but land use change and mapping that over time using something like global human settlements database. Second section would look at the enabling factors and bottlenecks for land use, including the regulatory frameworks and how they're governing the land use and how the links to access to finance in terms of land as a collateral, use of infrastructure, and the institutional capacity to manage land and financial proceeds. And we end here with thinking about how you can better align and integrate with other policy areas. And this is an area that we've written a lot about in the OECD of late, thinking about strategic land use practices, linking them to other sectoral areas, including the types of incentives that exist from tax and fiscal instruments to environmental policy to transportation policy, and thinking of it in really integrated manner so that you can better provide services and public infrastructure and so on at the local and regional level, to try and create complementarity between economic and regional and rural development programs. And that was a remark that was made in Sweden and by the European Commission, that there's a need to better integrate some of these programs, something we can look at in terms of how that affects land use. And finally, the integration of customary practices and traditional knowledge in national regulation and ways to map and understand that as it relates to land management.
Okay. And then on chapter 3, I think with each of the chapters, it's important to note that this is based on our dialogue with everyone to different degrees over the last 12 to 18 months about this topic, an initial review of policies and literature in different countries, and then these questions, as Tamara and Anna alluded to, are a starting point. So the logic will be that we will undertake a review of literature to understand the current state of knowledge. From that, develop some propositions and then collect evidence to test those propositions, and the evidence will be collected through a survey that we send, through analysis of documents, through analysis of data as well. So each of the chapters will follow that common logic. This chapter 3 is on, as I said, the business dimension, and so what policies help promote Indigenous entrepreneurship and innovation in rural areas. And again, this is a scope question about you have to make choices about what kinds of territories you focus on. We're proposing to focus on the rural, and in particular on the tradable sector. So those businesses which are involved in trading to other regions, other parts of the country or other countries, because the tradable sector is the key to growth in rural areas. So when we talked about some of those tradable sectors, particularly tourism as an example, or the mining sector. So in terms of the question, it's around, I mean, there are peculiar characteristics related to entrepreneurship in rural areas, which are different to metropolitan areas. And then there are issues related to Indigenous-owned businesses as well. So we want to explore those issues, and then look at, based on our analysis across countries, what are the areas of potential and strengths, and then what are the barriers and enabling factors to growth, innovation in rural Indigenous-owned businesses, and then what are some of the lessons that we can identify across countries in terms of how to overcome those barriers. In terms of the framework we use, we have a framework in the OECD which is used to assess the performance of small and medium-sized enterprises, and we think that we should apply, even as the framework we already have, we apply that framework to this issue, and we'll use that then to identify different policy recommendations, given obviously that there are very different arrangements around the regulation and support to businesses across countries, but we hope that what we can do through the analysis is draw out some common themes. In terms of the outline of that chapter, we would again look at the issues around definition around entrepreneurship in rural areas, and then what are the peculiar issues for Indigenous-owned businesses. What are the trends in Indigenous business growth across the participating countries, particularly opportunities in the tradable sector, and then what are some of these future changes in the business environment been for those businesses? There's been quite a bit of work going on in the OECD around this automation, around the Internet of Things, around climate change, around ageing population and health and wellbeing. So looking at some of those macro trends and what that might mean for Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then, as I mentioned, we have a framework that we use to assess and diagnose SMEs in the OECD, and that's based around 4 dimensions. And we look at the institutional and regulatory environment for business, the access to markets, which it can act, for example, markets around government procurement is a good example. Obviously, access to markets is also a physical thing, like roads and rail and communication infrastructure and so forth. And then access to resources, which businesses need to grow, finance, human capital, innovation, and then also culture and attitudes to business, so things like mentoring and what's the environment within the community that helps foster new entrepreneurs. So that's the sort of, that framework that we'll apply, and we're thinking of applying in this project. In terms of Chapter 4, in all our work, we have a strong focus on governance, and that means the relationships between different levels of government. At what level are decisions made about economic development? Do those different levels of government have competencies as well? And how do they create opportunities to engage with communities and the private sector in how decisions about public policy are made? Again, we need to adapt that framework for this project. And another key element in this work is around issues around self-governance and self-determination, and how you build the capacity of Indigenous organisations, Indigenous-run organisations, to manage economic development efforts. So that will be a key focus in this work. So we'll look at that issue and what are the factors which enable participation in the development process, how governments need to change the way that they work to better coordinate and tailor policies to the different circumstances of different communities. And then again, what are the lessons across countries from doing that? In terms of recommendations, it will be, we're thinking around, good practices around building the capacity of Indigenous organisations to participate in and manage economic development, how you might reform governance arrangements between levels of government to empower communities and also, again, integrate and tailor policies. And then particularly in rural remote areas is how you finance, provide and maintain local infrastructure and services on traditional lands in partnership with communities. And then the outline of the chapter basically will follow that logic around, again, building capacity at the local level, coordinating investment, decision-making across different levels of government, and then what are the sort of capabilities you need at a local level to make sure that works. So capabilities around leadership, around data as well, and the sort of financing models that you need to make it happen, particularly in remote areas. So that is a very quick outline of the thematic report. So we would welcome your comments and questions and interrogation on that. And so the floor is open to everyone to do that.
Luis, a mí me gustaría como hacer una recomendación en términos de lo que es la postura de los indígenas frente a estos temas. Para los indígenas colombianos, si bien hay una alta migración hacia los centros urbanos, consideran que es una acción con daño, acciones enfocadas a los indígenas urbanos. Ellos, digamos, están concentrados en el desarrollo y en la defensa de sus territorios tradicionales. Entonces, cuando hablamos de empleo y de cómo se vinculan, digamos que ahí tenemos que ser como muy cuidadosos a la hora de manejar esa información. Y lo segundo es que, no sé si la traducción o por lo menos ya encontré una vez que estaba escrita, se confunde el término entre comunidades indígenas y organizaciones indígenas. Y también son dos categorías completamente distintas. Entonces, en aras de ser preciso, digamos, de cuál es el sujeto de nuestra acción, pues habría que hablar de comunidades indígenas más que de organizaciones indígenas. Sí, porque luego sí les explico la diferencia de lo que eso implica en términos incluso políticos en Colombia, pero hay que ser claros, digamos, a la hora de usar ese término.
Yeah, I think, sorry, that's a good point, and I think we need to work through those definitional issues. I guess, a community is a group of people who share a sense of identity and belonging, and so there's that so it can be a network of people who share that common sense of belonging based on the historical use of their land and their common language and culture. And then, yes, there is a different element to the organisation which may govern that group, or different organisations which may govern multiple groups or exist at a national level. So I think, yeah, we need to obviously work through that. That is one issue. And then I think the issue about the type of territory is, again, an issue of scope, because our starting point, I guess, is the territory, the region. And if we look at, if we do a project that focuses on metropolitan and rural, it becomes very big. And then by making it big, you can't focus in depth. That's a trade-off that you have to make, because the dynamics of metropolitan economies and the kind of policies that you design for the metropolitan economies are very different to rural economies and how they work. So that's a trade-off. So if we do both, then you just go into less depth. Or do you make a decision to focus on one, and then you can go into more depth and have greater rigor around that issue. So it's a trade-off.
On the fourth chapter, I was wondering if it's worthwhile to include in there some kind of a look at the participating countries' own legislative framework and or the enablers for regional development, like how they compare, well, so much compare, maybe some of the leading practices, because we're hearing in Australia there might be some good things going on there that we should be highlighting. It's just, I know this seems really focused on the definitely engaging Indigenous people, but sometimes that engagement or the development can be either obstructed or facilitated through the type of government supports that, or lack thereof, in place. And so I think if you're looking at in that chapter 4, I think it would be important to, I don't know if you can do that in this kind of a report, but but some of the things that are working, I think there's some things here in Canada that are working too, and in different countries, and it would be nice to, it's not the same playing field that we're talking about here, and I don't see anywhere in this outline where that might be reflected.
Yeah. I think, so how about so are you focusing on, say, the governance and regulatory framework around land? Would that be, and how that?
So how the governments might support regional development that is Indigenous led. What are some of the things that some are doing, or if they're not doing anything? Yeah. I know this is why you're doing this project, but there might be some existing leading practices. I'm not sure. Yeah. I just thought that if we had some kind of information in that regard, because I think every country that spoke here talked about different kinds of legislation, different kinds of programs, but if there's some that are resulting in, or maybe there isn't any, I don't know, but I just kind of thought that it's a little bit different when I hear Peru talking about some of the policies that they're working on, and what's going on in Colombia. And, I don't know if that adds some value to this type of a project at all, to look at what's in place, because everyone's taken a little bit different approaches.
Yeah, I think so the project has 2 tiers. So one will be this global, one will be the case study, the country case studies. The country case study will enable us to dig into depth in each country about, well, what are some of those good practices that enable those outcomes that you're talking about. And then in this chapter, what we'll do is look at, okay, when we look at those practices in different countries, what are the common themes that emerge that seem to share, those good practices? What are the characteristics that they share? So what are some of the generalisations that we can build up across countries about how to make regional economic development work for Indigenous communities? And then within that, I think certainly in this report, this thematic report, is to highlight some of those good practices as well. And the way that we're thinking about that at the moment is that one condition you need to have in place is you need to have capacity within the community to participate, and that's sort of what we're trying to do in that second section up there is what are the models, the self-governance models, and the more softer factors like the people, the skills, the networks that make that happen. And then how do you get different levels of government working with Indigenous communities? So how do you, rather than departments or agencies looking at the world through their lens, trying to get them to look through the lens of the community and helping them facilitate the development outcomes that they want. And that's sort of what that second section will do. But to do that, you then need, in particular, the right capacities in local and regional governments around the right skills, the right cultural sensitivity to work with communities, and the right
This is just a small thing, but OECD reports always highlight best practices. We do boxes. And so as people have been talking these last couple of days, we've been highlighting what we think are really intriguing mechanisms. So we're going to follow up on those. And we do that throughout all of the research that we conduct, and including with peer reviewers. When peer reviewers come to on mission with us and tell us about things in their countries that are working well, then we follow up on those. So our best practices and our understanding of that come from a variety of sources, including the literature, including our peer reviewers, and including what we learn when we do in-depth case study research in countries.
I did see that being woven in there, and I just wanted to make sure, though, that we look at that, because there were some things in the SAMI presentation that I really like. There's definitely things in the Australian presentation that I really like, and I think I know the whole purpose of this exercise is to educate all the governments involved and open the doors and see some of the innovative ways people have been supporting Indigenous involvement in regional development. So I understand that. I just thought it was, there's some key differences that do exist, and I'm not sure if that's, like you say, it sounds like it might be woven in. I just want to make sure we don't forget that.
Yeah. Okay.
So slowly picking up on that, even within the country, so the definition of regions, or using the word region, is going to be difficult. It's within the cultural, the policy, and the legislative context within Canada, region to region, is very, very different. So the case studies are going to have to be very clear as to what sort of the baseline is that project is taking place, and certainly, if it's in a settled land claim area and there's land certainty, it's very, very different and has some incredible opportunities that you're not going to get elsewhere. And so there may be some best practices related to the integration of traditional knowledge in the settled land claim areas, or co-management regimes for decision making on a whole bunch of, whether it's about land use planning or whether it's about wildlife management. So definitely worth looking at some of the settled claim areas. So that's going to affect the definition. It's going to affect the region, how you define regions. I also think that in terms of the capacity, there's the capacity to be directly involved in regional economic development, but there's also the capacity to generate massive benefits as a result of true negotiation skills and not being involved. So impact benefit agreements are written into quite a bit of Canadian legislation, where a community or a group of communities can say, we don't actually want to be part of this development, but this is what you need to get the social license to operate. Which may be, it could be jobs, but it could also be, and there are again cases up north, where that social license to operate involves cash or contributions to other forms of infrastructure, pieces of infrastructure in the community. So I think looking at, or resource revenue sharing actually, where negotiating a really good resource revenue sharing agreement has been transformative in some regions, in the Cree region of Quebec, James Bay area, where they're not partners in hydro development, but they certainly are economic partners because they are guaranteed X million dollars a year from the Quebec government because of the development that's going on their land. And I would imagine at some point, and I don't know where it would fit, highlighting where conflict or where the process he's been to get to yes. So it's not just about building the capacity, but also masses of cases in Canada, projects taking years, development projects, not mega ones, years to get off the ground for very good reason, because the negotiated process, the give and take in coming to, win-win situations. I don't know if it's a question of conflict resolution or what the understanding. It's not just it's the journey, but the journey has a lot of subtle.
Did you want to? Yeah. On the point around negotiation, that would be more, I think, dealt with in this chapter on land, on the land governance, because in the end you have a legal right over land that enables you to participate in a negotiation, and then it's whether it. I mean, the question from a regional development point of view is that if you have that negotiation occurring around the social license, as you're describing, if the benefits which are negotiated for that community, does that generate a mutual win for the community and the region as a whole, or is it something that is a win just for the community? Because I mean, both from different points of view can be good, but perhaps from the view of how the economy works as a whole, maybe that's not the ideal outcome. So it's how you create situations where you deliver mutual benefit for the community and for the region within which that community is located. I think that's something that we, again, will explore in this work.
Which then links back to the organization versus community, and you're negotiating with communities, or you're negotiating, or communities negotiating collectively. So, I definitely, the benefits generally in Canada have accrued regionally when it's a collective that is negotiating, and it's not.
Oh, sorry, yeah. So just in terms of regions, we have a definition which is based on scale. So we have classification. So one region is the province in Canada, and then you have the region, the classification below, and then municipal level below that. So we have a hierarchy like that, and then we develop definitions of whether they are urban and rural based on the population density of the municipality, and then we build up a functional area, whether it becomes then urban or rural. So urban, rural, close to urban, or rural remote. So that's the sort of classification that we use, because then when you look at those different types of regions, they tend to have different growth drivers. So like the urban is more, obviously more service-based. It has a bigger internal market, so it can drive growth from within. Rural areas close to cities tend to be able to leverage those linkages, so they're closely integrated with metropolitan economies. And then obviously, as you know, rural remote are not integrated with metropolitan economies, and their growth more depends on their trade in activities which are not linked to their natural resource base. So again, like how we structure the report, because all those economies have different growth drivers, again, if you were to focus on all of them, it means that we get into less depth on the issues. That's the sort of trade-off that we make.
Thank you very much. For the floor, I was using Arctic Council style when I put my nameplate standing. But they have bigger there, so it shows more. First, the conditions in circumpolar Arctic are very different. If you involve Peru and Colombia, you will experience even bigger differences. But for indigenous peoples concerned, we have more similarities than differences when it comes to history and also to possibilities in future. But one thing I have learned, and in the Summit Parliament, I believe also, that having non-indigenous to be responsible for administration or surveillance or a guardian of indigenous culture will not function in the long run. The indigenous peoples have to be responsible for all of the taking care of the well-being of our own culture, or as we can say with some proudness, nothing about us without us. That means that we must be involved, and we cannot continue, at least in Sweden, the law from 1971 prevents in a quite efficient way the indigenous women and those persons, both men and women, who are without ownership to reindeer, to participate in the Sami village daily work. You are forced, the reindeer owner are forced to be a member in a Sami village, and it's not in accordance with paragraph 20, article 20 in the 1948 Universal Human Rights Instrument. It says that no one shall be forced to be part of an organization against its will. And it's not voluntarily chosen. It was the lawmaker who established this in 1971, and you would have a judicial person that could be brought to first make agreements, and then also could be put into responsibility for the actions. In the law, it also says that if you are going over from reindeer husbandry and you get a steady job in a company or a steady Swedish job, you can be disconnected from the Sami village. That your membership can be invalid and you have nothing to say about it. It is the Sami village who decides that. And of course, that is also that it makes it also a little bit complicated to increase to make it possible to increase the economy. To in some extent, some persons have to be maybe full-time working in an increasing economy, and if we have the rigid laws from 1971 that still today says that you are excluded from the Sami village, it is not a good solution. But I'm not asking the OECD to take care of internal problems, because I consider that this is more or less an internal problem for the Sami, or for the Sami parliament. We have a duty to do that, and it might take some time, but I want to single out the problem. It says also in the Reindeer Husbandry Act that I, as a Sami person, member in the Sami village, have some certain rights, hunting and fishing, and also having the reindeers for grazing in the Sami village area. But I'm not allowed to ask my best Swedish friend to come and hunt with me, but using a rifle. That is not allowed. So I mean, it should not be, and the Sami village are not allowed to make any agreements that means that the Sami rights, hunting, fishing, grazing rights, are diminishing. And I find that very, very promising and very rewarding. I mean, if you don't want to be indigenous, okay, no problem. You just go to an ordinary city or to an ordinary village and do whatever you want to do, and don't care about your history, and you are happy as long as you live. But you are not allowed to destroy the possibility for others who want to be indigenous and want to carry out the culture in an uncertain future without knowing if the law or if the relatives or if someone else will stop you. So I don't find it rewarding for indigenous people to make agreement with mining companies to have permits for mining activities, since we know for sure that the water quality are declining, and we also have the experience in Sweden and Finland that we have a long history of extraction activities, and you should add up all the activities that have been going on for 100 years, and this also means that what has happening during so long time has also affected the nature. The water quality are diminishing. The forests are almost in the same age. There are very little protected areas in the eastern part of northern Sweden. The most protected areas in the is close to the high mountain, where it's the longest way to the paper mills, and the timber are of poor quality and expensive to clear cut. So the summary of all this makes it, and you should also remember that the extraction of natural resources has also meant that the culture remains, the valuable culture remains, both from Sami culture and settlers' culture have been disappearing in high extent. The paths are gone, and you can see the traditional, don't see the traditional corrals where they have been. You can't see the milking grounds where they have been milking the reindeers. Everything, almost everything, has been disappearing. People have been moving away, and those who knew a different time that have been doesn't live any longer. But those who live have to find a solution to continue. And just my interventions yesterday, or in that aspect, to find a solution, to find new possibilities to reconcile with the national states. It is exactly a little more than 10 years since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples were adopted by UN General Assembly, and the current chair of Permanent Forum, Victoria Tauli-Corpus, stated that finally the world's indigenous peoples and the national states have reconciliated and decided to follow a path of human rights. And this is a living process. And before the human rights, the value of human rights have been accepted, and before we feel that we are involved in the solution-making process, also not only here in the meeting rooms, but also out on the local and regional ground, then it's not so much needed for a finding commission, or to find what's the wrongdoing for the last 50 years, because we know that already, and with what we need and what we must have in order to have the most valuable capacity, or most valuable thing that we can have in the Arctic, that are the humans, both the indigenous and also our non-indigenous neighbors, because we have more in common east-westly direction than we have north-southly direction. But my final conclusion to this is that we must have the involvement of indigenous peoples in decision-making processes. In Nordic countries, it's easy. We are the Sami parliament who can speak for ourselves, but in other part of Arctic, or in countries where there are many peoples without legal protection, it might be a problem. But we must be part of the process to be safeguarding our own culture. That is my statement, and I am not so convinced that it can be easier to have, for instance, a mining permit when the indigenous peoples are safeguarding the culture and the nature. Thank you.
I don't know exactly where it is, but I'm thinking about the recommendations and how they can be useful for Peru and probably other countries. I think recommendations should be helpful for policy decision makers at the highest level to convince them that they should implement these recommendations. So probably something in the line of this economics and ecosystem and biodiversity reports, crossing, for instance, how indigenous peoples are losing for not preserving their resources, because probably in other countries happens the same, but in Peru, indigenous people's land are not all used traditionally, it's not all used as traditionally as it was. They have to survive, but they have no disinformation. government agencies as well don't have exactly information how much they are losing to participate in, for instance, the agricultural projects in the Amazon, where the land is not prepared for that. And just to think about the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the cost of not using it properly, in the case of indigenous people, not use it in a traditional way, and the cost of its depletion. So how much it costs using it not wisely, and if we cross it in countries like Peru with biodiversity, this information for biodiversity maybe that will convince policy decision maker that take action, because that is costing not just indigenous people, but everybody. I know that is a complicated thing, but I think that getting a bit closer to that at least will be very helpful. And the other point that I want to make is following Maria Teresa's about community and indigenous organization. This is going to be an issue when implementing the project, but I keep thinking about, we're talking about economic development and economic opportunities, and our indigenous organizations, their agenda is a political one. There is still an agenda for recognitions of rights. So, and it's not the same agenda necessarily of the agenda of each community. They look at it as a whole and gaining more rights or better implementation of rights and policies, while the community is just looking at their own survival, whatever they have in mind, and keeping their cultures alive. So I think that's something that should be taken into consideration, which is a very complex issue in Peru.
I think on the first issue about the stewardship of land and environmental services, as I understood it, that is something that we were thinking of exploring in Chapter 1, because in other cases, you know, farmers are paid for their environmental stewardship, for example. So there is, yeah, in the EU. So there are examples of where, because land and water resources are managed in a sustainable way, that there is some payment, you know, associated with that. So that's, you know, something that that we think we will explore in this work as a, you know, as a source of income in Chapter 1. And then the other thing is how traditional knowledge or knowledge that communities have about land and water resources, how that knowledge is then incorporated into decision making about land, the management of land and the regulation of land. And that's something we're thinking about in Chapter 2. And then in the report as a whole, I mean, we are focusing on these questions of economic development and what are the practices that can be put in place to better support Indigenous economic development in a regional place-based context. I think it's difficult for us as an institution to get involved in debates about rights. We can sort of acknowledge that and look at the effect that that might have on economic development outcomes. We can also look at it in that way, but getting into a debate about rights is difficult for us as an institution that represents national governments. But we can acknowledge that, again, acknowledge it and look at the impacts on development outcomes. I think that's probably the way that we would look at it, rather than getting into a debate about what rights should be and shouldn't be, because I don't think that's appropriate for us to do that.
Yeah, I was not talking about rights, I was talking about economics.
Yes, yeah.
I explained myself before. Just showing in numbers why these recommendations should be taken into consideration.
Yes.
I know rights is a very sensitive issue and government not take it.
Yep. Yeah.
And when you talk about land, you also land and natural resources. I'm sure it's here.
Yep. What's on the land, under the, on the land, and the water that flows through it. But I think you know, if you're managing the resource in a way that, because the resource delivers benefit, you know, the but then it delivers things like clean air, for example, and clean water. So I think, as I said, there are other cases where you have compensation for the management of the land and the benefit that delivers. So I think it would be interesting for us to look at examples of that across countries and how that has worked, and the sort of long-term benefit that it delivers because people have that compensation. So it's something that we want to explore. Yeah.
Unless Warren wants to speak right now, but I just wanted to a couple of things. One is that in chapter 3 you were talking about global value chains, and one of the things that I find is that when you look at the value chain, our people are at the lower end of that value chain. We don't get to reap the kind of benefits of any industry or sector when it's being developed. And I think as you look at that, I'm not too sure if that was what you meant by the global value chains, but I think looking at where we stand in those value chains, I think would be really important. I think of my good friend Harold Calla, who, from BC, and he often talks about the value chains and where we stand in Canada. And so I think that that's something that we need to look at a little bit in depth, to maybe comment on that, not just global, but just generally in some of this. And when I think of the issue of regions as well versus, not versus, but in terms of the study and or looking at the communities, most Indigenous communities are actually regionally based in nature, I would think. We have, in my area, for example, I'm from a First Nation community that's part of the larger Anishinaabe Nation. And so we're already part of a larger group. And if you look at the east coast of Canada, and we have a lot of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And so to me, that's looking at an Indigenous group. And I'm sure that this is in some ways very similar in some of the groups that you're looking at. It will be a little bit different because you look at New Zealand, they have just the Maori people, and when you compare that to Canada, where we have about 500 different groups, or no, it says 50 nations I saw up there, and I guess that's more the linguistic groups. And so I think that those are the kinds of regions we should look at, is where there's a collective of, rather than the individual communities, because I think that that's most important going forward. I think of groups like the Mi'kmaq Nation, and there's a possible good case study there and some of the things that they've established, their processes. And I think of the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation in the Northwest Territories, and some of the things that they're doing in protecting the culture, language, but also working on economic development. And so those are two, I think, areas in Canada where it's a collective of communities that are all part of a shared traditional territory or shared Indigenous culture. And so those are the kinds of things in my mind, anyway, that we look at. And I know I share Stefan's view on a lot of the development, I think. And the thing is, though, I respect the decisions of our own Indigenous nations, as long as they're informed decisions. That's the thing. That's so important. And I keep coming back around to that. And if a nation, after being fully informed on any kind of development in their region, and they make a certain decision, I fully support that as long as it's an informed decision.
If I can just return to this part of regional definitions, it's something definitely we looked at also the case in the Amazon region. These communities don't end even at country borders. They extend all over the Amazon through many different countries. But in the semantic part, unfortunately, we are bounded by whatever definitions government use in their statistics. So that's why we talk about regions as they are administratively defined. But we're going to have a part where we acknowledge that these borders don't necessarily make sense for indigenous communities, that they can be crossed. In the country case studies, then we're going to go more into depth about these issues. But in chapter 1, at least, we're going to use as much detail as we can in the spatial units to be able to grasp some of these differences. And also the logic to use this kind of administrative divisions there is to look at it also from the government perspective, so from the regional economies at the levels at which plans are made for these communities. So this is a big issue also for Colombia, where communities can be in the jurisdiction of even 2 level 1 administrative units. And these are the things that we're going to look at, the incompatibility of borders, what kind of effect that has. But for the summary, what we're going to do in chapter 1, I think we're going to have to rely on existing administrative, if artificial boundaries for the analysis, for the at least showing some of the statistics and charts, but then also minding that this may not be the most relevant definitions for indigenous communities as such.
And I think that this is a good point about the scale. So if we look at a group of communities that are related and have a common identity, and then within a geographical area, then of course we can do that. I mean, it's sort of then we just look at a bigger region and we look at how a group of communities make their contribution to that bigger region and their impact on the region, and what sort of strategies they put in place together to improve their economic outcomes and improve outcomes for the region as a whole. I think that's within the framework of our approach. Yep.
For example, the Mi'kmaq Nation goes across several provinces, and they recently did a study about the economic impact that they've had in the whole Atlantic region, and it's very significant. And I think looking at the definition of being a province, that where Atlantic works together quite a bit as a region, as opposed to 4 separate provinces. I think it's some of that the definitions that you would look at might need to be adjusted, because I think that there's some collective work that's done based on could be based on the Nakon Nations as well, First Nations being the Mi'kmaq, but there's Maliseet in there as well, Atlantic.
Just a funny Canadian point of reference, since you live in Paris. Quebec is 16 times bigger than France. Yes. So there.
I guess we need a region. I mean, a region across provinces might be difficult, because then we're talking about it's almost like a mega. I'm doing a project at the moment which is looking at a mega region, which is more how do a group of regions, economic regions, connect together as a whole. And then, but I hadn't thought about that concept for this project. For this project, we were more thinking like, I'm just thinking like, well, in Australia, like an Arnhem Land or the Kimberley, or that kind of region, which is like a group of functional regions, as in like people can move around, within a couple of hours, group together, and you can sort of analyse it in that way. But anyway, I think we'll have to think about that. Well, if there's not any more comments on the thematic, I can move on to the case studies, which will require a bit of homework or a bit of thinking from you guys. In terms of the case studies, as I said, this jumps into developing analysis for each country and to develop some recommendations about how national governments can help better facilitate, enable economic development outcomes for Indigenous communities. Each case study we're thinking, sort of depending on country, will be sort of 80 or 40 pages in length, again, depending on the contribution we get. And each of them will focus on a particular thematic areas. So, for example, it might be around innovation, it could be around skills, it could be around infrastructure and service provision. And so that would then be negotiated with each country within the framework of the project. As I mentioned, we would base the analysis on engagement with a number of place-based Indigenous communities, which I've been talking about just then, and then that would then provide inputs to the thematic report, particularly in terms of identifying good practices and lessons from across different countries. In terms of those case studies, they're probably going to follow a similar logic, like we would look at the basic institutional setting for Indigenous economic development in the country. What are the key trends around Indigenous people in the economy? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the current policy framework, and then how should that be changed? So that logic is very broad, but it would be applied to the particular issues that each country is interested in. Now, what I've done is develop a little handout, which should be next to you on the table, which just outlines, based on some initial feedback from the countries about, and Anna, I don't know if you want to, Anna, if you come around with the comments, because it's in English. It sort of just sets out what each country has said is of interest to them, based on the questionnaire that they returned. And what we wanted you to do is just to, based on your own knowledge and expertise, is to begin to, or spend about 10 minutes looking at the questions that are over the page. So if you turn over the page, there's a page titled Record of Conversation. And what we want to do is to begin for you to think about it, as I said, over the next 10 minutes, to begin to write down some key points in relation to each of those topics, and then we can have a discussion about them. So we have about 45 minutes or so. So if you can just do that now, and then we can have a sort of report back on it. And it's basically to begin the process of thinking through what each of these case studies might focus on. Now, I thought an example of this in some work that we've done, and we did a study a while ago. It was called Promoting Growth in All Regions, and we were looking at regions from across the OECD, ones which were poor but had made progress, had been able to increase their per capita income over two different business cycles. And so we did all regions of the OECD. We looked at all of them, and identified a whole cohort of them that had been able to demonstrate this and had performed above average. And then we selected some case studies of those regions, and we looked at looked at them in terms of what are the factors which enabled them to make this shift, to make this transition. So one way to think about the selection of case studies is to identify communities that have been able to make a transition, have been able to make progress around economic development, and then we focus in on those communities, and we assess what are the factors which then led to them being able to make that transition. And hopefully, when you look at a group or a whole sample of communities across countries and different countries, you would hope that some common themes emerge and some conclusions that we're able to generalise, because this is very important in terms of then identifying what are the kinds of policies that can be put in place to help other communities also make that transition. So that's one way of thinking about it. So as I said, about 10 minutes, if you could start going through those topics and record your initial thoughts, and then we'll have a report back on that.
By country.